On a night when the plains belonged to snow and silence, Thomas Avery thought he carried only. As the sun bled fire across the prairie, 3 riders came to claim what they swore was theirs. The wind carried the sharp bite of winter as Thomas Avery rode along the ridge above the frozen creek. The sun had dipped low, a dull ember sinking behind the jagged horizon, casting the plains in hues of blue and ash. His horse's breath steamed. In the air, each exhale a ghost rising into the cold. He had ridden this stretch countless times before, driving cattle in warmer months, patrolling fence lines when storms threatened to break them down. Yet tonight the land felt strange, hushed, as though the snow itself were listening. That was when he saw her. At first, she looked like another drift of ice, a pale figure slumped at the edge of the creek bed, her skirts frozen stiff around her legs. But then the faintest movement caught his eye, a trembling hand against the snow, weak as a dying flame. He pulled his horse to a halt, staring. The land did not forgive the unprepared. Many had been found stiff in the frost, claimed by the prairie's indifference. Yet something in the way she fought, feebly, desperately, made him swing down from his saddle. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks raw with cold. A dark bruise spread across her temple, and her dress was torn near the shoulder. She tried to speak, the words scratching through a throat that had carried too much dust and grief. Leave me here, to die. Then her eyes closed, lashes dusted with ice. Thomas stood still, the reins loose in his hand. Every part of him urged retreat. He had lived too long in silence to invite the burden of another's pain. The years since his wife's passing had taught him that life could be endured alone if not lived fully. Yet his boots moved before his thoughts could stop them. He stooped, gathered her frail body in his arms, and felt the heat of fever burning beneath the cold. The ride back was slow. The snow thickened, clinging to his coat, to her tangled hair that smelled faintly of smoke and rain. His horse labored, uphill, hooves crunching through ice until at last the familiar outline of his ranch emerged. A lonely cabin squatting against the wind, smoke trailing thinly from the chimney. Inside, silence ruled. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, carrying her across the threshold. The room breathed of wood smoke and solitude. Shadows leaned against the walls, broken only by the fire's faint glow. The old rocking chair near the hearth creaked in the draft, as though stirred by unseen hands. He remembered how it had once moved beneath his wife's weight, her needlework spread across her lap, her quiet humming stitched into the very grain of the walls. Now it rocked with no rhythm, no warmth, only memory. He laid the woman gently upon the narrow bed. The quilt folded there had belonged to his late wife, a pattern of faded blues and browns, worn soft by years of touch. He hesitated, hand, lingering, then covered the stranger with it, though her shivers did not cease. Fetching water, he dampened a cloth and pressed it to her brow. Fever scorched beneath her skin. He reached for a lantern, lifting its glow to examine her more closely. That was when he noticed the blood seeping faintly through her dress near the ribs. With measured care, he drew back the fabric to see, and then he froze. Not from impropriety, nor the awkwardness of laying bare what modesty would guard, but from the sheer brutality carved into her flesh. A lash mark, deep and deliberate, ran across her side, raised and red as though seared by cruelty itself. The edges were raw, the wound far too clean to be an accident. It was not nature that had struck her down, but human hands. His stomach tightened. For years, he had seen men whip horses, break oxen, even mark their cattle with brands. But to mark a woman so? It was not survival. It was ownership. It was degradation, meant to strip her of dignity until nothing remained. He replaced the cloth, his hands rough from work yet careful now, as though touching something sacred. She stirred faintly, but did not wake. He poured water into a cup, placed it near the bed should she rouse, then sank into the chair across from her. The fire snapped, throwing sparks against the chimney stone. Outside, the storm deepened, wind clawing at the windows. He sat with his rifle propped by the door as he always did, though tonight it felt less like habit and more like necessity. His gaze lingered on her face, not with hunger, but with something closer to recognition. The hollowed cheeks, the weariness, the silence carved too deep. He knew those marks well. Loss had etched them into his own reflection years ago. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let the silence weigh. He thought of the words she had spoken. "Leave me here to die." They rang in his mind like a prayer too weary to reach heaven. He wondered how long she had carried that desire, how many doors had closed before she collapsed in the snow. The rocking chair moaned softly beside him, and for a heartbeat he felt his wife's absence, as though she sat there still, watching, waiting, urging. At last, he drew a slow breath and looked back to the woman sleeping fitfully beneath the quilt. "No," he murmured, voice barely above the crackle of fire. "I can't do that. Not yet." The flames danced, shadows shifting across the walls. The scar on her ribs seemed to glow in the light, a wound that mirrored his own unseen scars. Pain had bound them, though neither had chosen it. Thomas sat back, staring into the hearth, unsettled by the strange truth creeping over him. He could not abandon her. He did not know why, only that he would not. The night stretched long, the storm raging without, the fire holding within. And for the first time in years, the house did not feel entirely empty. The fever broke on the third morning. Snow still clung to the edges of the windows, blurring the horizon in a haze of white. But inside the cabin, the fire kept a steady rhythm. Thomas sat where he often did, near the hearth, boot heels resting, on the worn planks, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands. He had dozed little in those days, half listening to the woman's shallow breaths, the fevered murmurs that slipped from her lips in fragments. Sometimes she cried out, sometimes she begged, sometimes she fell into silence so deep he thought the frost had claimed her for good. But on that morning, her eyes opened. They were a muted brown, the color of earth after rain, dulled by exhaustion, yet stubbornly alive. She blinked at the rafters, then at the quilt drawn up beneath her chin. For a moment, confusion clouded her, as if she were unsure which side of death she had woken on. "You're safe," Thomas said quietly, setting the cup aside. His voice was rough from disuse, low as gravel. Her gaze found him then, lingering, on the lines carved into his face, the days of stubble shadowing his jaw. She wet her lips, but her voice rasped when it came. "Where am I?" "My ranch," he replied. "Found you by the creek. You've been out near 3 days." Her brow furrowed as though the memory returned in pieces. She turned her face slightly, coughing weakly into the quilt. After a pause, she whispered, "I should have stayed there." Thomas said nothing. He had learned long ago that words, offered too quick, often rang hollow. Instead, he rose, poured water into a tin cup, and held it to her. She drank slowly, her hands trembling around the rim. "Elena," she said finally, setting the cup down with care. "My name is Elena." The name settled between them like a fragile seed, unsure whether the ground would receive it. He gave a short nod. "Thomas." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the wind pressing against the walls. At last, she drew the quilt tighter around herself and began to speak again, haltingly, as though each word cost her more than she could spare. "My husband, gone near 2 years now. Fever took him before spring thaw." Her eyes fell to the floorboards, her voice thinning. "His family said I'd cursed the land, said I had no right to stay once he was buried. I begged them, but they wanted the acres for themselves." Thomas watched her hands knot the quilt, knuckles white. "They turned me out with nothing but a satchel," she continued. "Since then, I've wandered, from town to town. Some doors opened, most did not." She drew a ragged breath. "And then—" Her voice faltered, the words withering in her throat. Thomas didn't press. He could see the shadow of it plain in the bruises that had not yet faded, in the lash mark across her ribs, whatever hand had done that still lingered close in her memory, and perhaps too near in the land. I don't need to know it yet, he said, his tone even. Not until you're ready. Her eyes flicked to his, surprised by the gentleness in the refusal. She gave the faintest nod and leaned back against the pillow, exhaustion pulling at her again. Thomas sat down once more, the silence returning, though it no longer felt quite so hollow. His gaze drifted to the rocking chair by the hearth. It leaned slightly forward, its unfinished armrest still bearing the rough edges he had never sanded smooth. He had meant to complete it years ago, as a gift for his wife. But she had died, before he could put knife to wood again. Since then it had sat there, half-finished, a monument to intentions that had withered along with her laughter, the memory pressed against him now, sharp and familiar. He remembered the day she died, how her dress had hung drying near the fire while he dug her grave beneath a sky too cold for mourning, how he had left the rifle leaning by the door in case coyotes came sniffing, the steel too heavy in his hands when the earth seemed heavier still. He had thought the grief would lessen with years, yet it had only settled deeper, becoming part of the bones that carried him. Now here was this woman, this Elena, lying beneath that same quilt, bearing, scars different in form but not in weight. She too had been cut loose from the world, cast aside until nothing remained but the will to collapse in the snow. When she stirred again, her gaze wandered the cabin. She noticed the tools hung neatly on the wall, saws, hammers, branding, irons, each in its place though some bore the dust of long disuse. Her eyes drifted over the shelves lined with jars of beans and coffee, the rifle propped always within reach, the emptiness of the space where laughter should have lived. Her gaze lingered last on the rocking chair. Something in her expression shifted, as if she understood it for what it was, not just a chair but a wound left unfinished. Thomas followed her eyes, then looked away, uneasy beneath her silent knowing. Later, when he rose to refresh the fire, his glance brushed over her once more. The quilt had slipped, revealing the edge of her scarred side. She caught him looking and turned quickly, face tight with shame. I wasn't... He stopped himself. Words had never come easy. He set another log on the fire, its sparks flaring, and kept his back to her a while. Elena said nothing. But in the silence, the truth sat plain between them. Both bore marks that could not be hidden, whether on flesh or in memory. Both had known abandonment, one branded into skin, the other carved into the soul. The snow outside thickened, swallowing the prairie in a hush. Within the cabin, two survivors sat in the quiet, their scars unseen and seen alike, their breaths weaving a fragile thread against the storm. Neither knew yet what tether had begun to form between them, but both felt dimly that the silence no longer belonged to loneliness alone. The day had worn thin, stretched gray across the horizon, when the first rumble of thunder rolled low over the plains. It was a heavy sound, like iron dragged across stone, promising a storm that would not pass lightly. Thomas paused on the porch, gaze sweeping the sky. Clouds were piling in dark walls to the west, their bellies swollen with rain. The air itself had changed, sharp, metallic, the kind that sets a horse to pacing restlessly. He muttered low, more to himself than to the woman inside, "Best get the barn ready." Pulling on his coat, he stepped out into the growing wind. The cold hit him full in the face, carrying the smell of rain and dust. His boots sank into the damp earth as he moved quickly toward the corral. The horses shifted nervously, ears flicking at the thunder. He spoke to them in the same low tone he had once used to calm his wife in the throes of fever, steady, almost prayerful. As he worked the latches and secured the gates, his eye caught something in the mud near the fence line. Tracks. Fresh. 2. Fresh to have been washed by the coming rain. 3. Maybe 4 riders had passed not long ago. He crouched, pressing a hand to the print, feeling the sharp edge where the hoof had broken soil. These weren't wandering strays. They had purpose. His jaw tightened. By the time he returned to the cabin, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, spattering against the windows like thrown pebbles. He pushed the door open, shaking water from his hat, and found Elena seated, near the fire, her shawl wrapped tight across her shoulders. She looked up at him, and though she tried to mask it, he saw the fear flicker in her eyes. "You saw something?" she whispered, her voice brittle. "Tracks," Thomas said simply, hanging his coat to drip near the door. "Men on horseback, been through not long ago." Her hands clutched the shawl tighter. "They're looking for me." He stood still, water dripping from his sleeve onto the floorboards. He didn't ask how she knew. Her trembling told enough. The storm broke then, sudden and fierce, rattling the cabin walls. Lightning split the sky in white veins, followed by thunder that shook the very ground. The storm seemed to crawl inside the cabin itself, filling every silence with its growl. Elena flinched with each strike, though she tried to hide it. Thomas added wood to the fire, the flames snapping high, driving back the shadows. "They won't come through this storm," he said, not to soothe but as plain fact. Still, he kept his rifle propped by the hearth. Later, when the rain lashed hardest against the windows, Thomas set a pot on the coals. The smell of beans and coffee soon filled the cabin, thick and grounding. Elena stirred at the scent, sitting straighter. It had been too long since she'd eaten more than a scrap. When he set the tin bowls before them, she watched him curiously. He ate slow, methodical, as though each bite bore the weight of memory. She noticed the way he paused between mouthfuls, staring into the fire before continuing, as if he were eating not just food, but all the silence he had lived with since his wife's passing. She tried to eat as well, though her hands shook. For the first time, they shared more than words. The crack of storm outside and the crackle of fire inside became their company. After the meal, Thomas leaned back in his chair, boots stretched toward the fire. Elena settled again beneath the quilt, eyes heavy. The rhythm of rain against the roof grew almost lulling, though lightning still split the night. Sleep came for her in broken fragments. Thomas sat with his rifle across his knees, listening to her breath falter, then deepen. Soon the words came, not spoken but muttered from the pit of a dream she could not escape. "No, don't, stop." Her voice twisted, her body twitching beneath the quilt. "Bound. They dragged me." Thomas's hands tightened on the rifle. His eyes fixed on her, though he did not wake her. He knew the danger of pulling someone from a nightmare too sharp. Instead, he kept his vigil, letting her ride it out, though each word tore through him like splinters. He had seen men capable of such cruelty. Settlers who claimed justice yet dealt only in ownership. Ranchers who took land from the natives, calling it progress, and took women when the land was not enough. He had seen lashes fall not to correct but to break. And always the silence afterward, the kind that buried dignity deeper than the grave. Lightning struck close, the thunder shaking the panes. Elena gasped in her sleep, turning toward the wall as though to shield herself. Thomas rose then, stepping to the window. He peered into the storm, though all he could see was rain. Still, he held the rifle ready. He knew men well enough to understand storms seldom stopped them for long. If they wanted what they claimed, they would come. Behind him, Elena's whispers softened into exhausted breaths. She had slipped back into deeper sleep, though the tremor in her hand still betrayed the weight of her dream. Thomas set the rifle back against the hearth, but kept his hand near. He sank into the chair, staring at the fire. The storm would pass, but the danger would not. For the first time, he felt the full truth of it settle upon him like the cold. By taking her in, by laying his wife's quilt across her broken body, he had chosen a path he could not turn from. She was not safe. And if he sheltered her, neither was he. But as he watched the fire lick the logs, casting its glow across her scarred face, he knew what he would do if men came riding. He would not hand her back to them, not to be bound, not to be broken. The storm roared on, thunder answering thunder, echoing the turmoil building inside them both. The storm broke, but its shadow lingered. For days the sky hung low, swollen with clouds that spat sleet and drizzle across the land. The ground turned to mud, and the air carried the smell of damp earth and smoke. Inside the cabin, silence pressed, closer than ever, heavy as wool on the shoulders. Elena had strength enough now to move about, though she favored her side when she walked. The scar ached. Thomas could see it in the way her hand sometimes pressed the quilt tighter against her ribs. She began to help where she could, rinsing the tin dishes, sweeping ash from the hearth, mending a torn sleeve of his shirt with thread so fine it seemed her hands were born to it. Yet every task only seemed to deepen the unease between them. "Should leave," she said one afternoon, standing near the window with the light gray on her face. Her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder, stray strands catching the pale shine. "I've stayed too long. Trouble follows me." Thomas looked up from the harness he was oiling. He let the silence stretch before answering. "You step outside in this weather, you won't last a night. I'd rather risk the weather than see this place burned because of me," she replied. Her voice trembled, though she fought to keep it steady. He set the rag aside, his eyes fixed on the leather strap in his lap. "Fire don't scare me, but throwing someone to the wolves, that I can't do." Her gaze lingered on him, searching, but he gave nothing more. That night by the fire, the air grew thicker with the weight of unspoken things. Elena sat on the low stool, weaving a small braid into her hair with trembling fingers. She did it, slowly, deliberately, as if the act itself granted her control over something life had stripped away. Thomas watched without meaning to, noting the way the braid smoothed what chaos the storm, and her scars, had left behind. He did not speak of it. He only sipped his coffee and stared at the flames. When she looked up and caught him watching, he turned his eyes quickly back to the fire. Neither spoke. The days passed like that, taut as a rope strung between two posts. They worked in silence, ate in silence, moved about the cabin careful not to touch, though the space between them seemed charged with all the words neither dared to say. At night, when the fire burned low, Thomas lay on his cot, staring at the rafters. He could hear Elena shift in the bed across the room, the faint rustle of the quilt, the uneven cadence of her breath. The house felt too small for such distance, yet too large for the closeness neither of them would allow. On the fourth evening after the storm, Elena carried a pail to the well. The air was brittle with the bite of approaching frost, the prairie, rolling silent and gray beneath the fading light. She lowered the bucket, the rope creaking, then hauled it back up with both hands. Water sloshed against the rim, spilling cold over her fingers. When she turned, she froze. A rider sat on the ridge beyond the pasture. He was still as stone, a dark shape against the paling sky, horse standing quiet beneath him. He did not move, only looked, the tilt of his hat casting his face in shadow. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The pail trembled in her grasp, water spilling across her skirts. Inside the cabin, Thomas had already stepped to the doorway. His rifle hung loose in his hand, barrel angled toward the ground but ready. He did not speak. He only moved to stand beside her, his presence solid, unyielding. The rider lingered another long moment, scanning the ranch with the patience of a hunter. Then, without a word, he turned his horse and rode along the ridge, vanishing behind the swell of land. Elena's knees weakened. She set the pail down hard, breath ragged. Thomas kept his eyes on the ridge a long while, rifle never lowering. Finally, he said in his low, steady way, "They're watching." Her face had gone pale as chalk. "It's him," she whispered. "One of them." Thomas's jaw worked, but he gave no answer. He only guided her back toward the cabin, his hand hovering close to her elbow without quite touching. Inside, he set the rifle across the mantel, closer now than it had been before. The silence that followed was thick with fear. Elena sat near, the fire, her braid coming loose, fingers twisting at the fringe of her shawl. Thomas moved about the room in short, purposeful motions, checking the latch, adding wood to the fire, filling the lamp. Every gesture spoke of readiness, though his face remained composed. When at last he settled into the chair, the firelight flickering across his worn features, Elena found her voice. "You don't understand what they'll do if they find me. Here." Thomas's gaze flicked toward her, hard but not unkind. "I've seen men like them. I understand plenty." Her eyes filled, though she blinked fast against the tears. "Then you know you should send me away." The rocking chair groaned, as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe, but I won't." The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Elena turned her face from him, her braid falling across her shoulder like a shield. Thomas sat watching the flames, the weight of choice heavy in the room. The night crept on, the cabin heavy with silence once more. Not the emptiness of strangers, but the charged quiet of two souls bound by danger, bound by restraint, bound by a past that would not stay buried. And outside, somewhere beyond the ridge, a man was waiting. The ridge had grown quiet since the lone rider disappeared, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of a trap being set. Thomas knew it. He rose earlier each morning, patrolling the fence line, checking the corral, oiling the rifle more than once. Elena moved with restless hands inside the cabin, fixing, mending, rearranging, as if order might hold back the chaos closing in. Both lived with the waiting. Both heard the hoofbeats long before they arrived. It was late afternoon when the sound carried across the prairie. 3 riders crested the rise, the dying sun flashing against the metal of their rifles. They came, at a steady pace, not rushing, not hiding, the slow, deliberate gait of men who believed they had already won. Elena was at the window. The pail slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor, spilling water across the boards. Her breath came in quick bursts, her body trembling as though the very sight of the men pulled her back into the hands that had beaten her, broken her, left her for dead. "They've come," she whispered, her voice dry as ash. Thomas stepped past her without a word. He opened the door and walked out into the yard, his rifle resting against his shoulder, his shadow stretching long in the sinking light. Elena followed only to the doorway, clutching the frame as though it might hold her upright. The riders reined, in a few yards from the porch. The one in the middle leaned forward in the saddle, face hard as stone beneath the brim of his hat. "You've got something that belongs to us," he called, his voice carrying clear across the open yard. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Don't reckon I do." The rider's lip curled. "The woman, that widow's a thief. She betrayed her own husband's kin. She don't deserve shelter, only a grave." Behind him, one of the others spat into the dirt. "Best step aside. Cowboy, ain't no sense dying for a traitor." Elena's fingers dug into the wood of the doorway. "No," she whispered. "No, it isn't true. I stole nothing but my own freedom." Her voice cracked, breaking with the weight of memory and fear. Thomas shifted his stance, the setting sun burning red along the edge of his rifle. "She's under my roof," he said evenly. "That means she's under my protection." The middle rider's hand slid toward his pistol. "Then you've chosen your side." The air between them snapped taut, the prairie holding its breath. Elena stumbled forward, desperate, her skirts brushing the dirt. "Stop, please. I'll go with you. I'll end this." But Thomas moved quicker, stepping in front of her, his broad frame shielding her completely. He didn't look back at her, only kept his eyes on the 3 men. His voice came low, steady as bedrock. "You're not theirs to take." The crack of a rifle shattered the stillness. For a moment, no one moved, not even Thomas. Then one of the riders jerked backward, crying out as blood bloomed across his shoulder. The other 2 wheeled in shock, looking toward the ridge. Up there, faint against the dying light, a figure stood, young, lithe, wrapped in the earth-toned garb of a scout. The glint of his rifle barrel caught the sun for an instant before it vanished again. A ghost, a shadow, an ally. Thomas knew him. The Comanche boy whose father had once saved his life in a skirmish long ago. A debt repaid, silent and sure. The yard erupted, gunfire cracked, muzzle flashes tore the dusk apart. Thomas fired once, twice, the recoil slamming against his shoulder. Dirt spat up at his boots as bullets struck the ground near him. Elena crouched low against the porch rail, her hands clamped over her ears, eyes wide with terror. One rider toppled from his horse, clutching his leg, his groans breaking the chaos. The other two, shaken by the shot from the ridge, spurred their mounts hard and fled into the twilight, their curses fading with the thunder of hooves. When the dust settled, silence rushed back in, louder than the gunfire had been. Thomas lowered, his rifle chest rising and falling with the force of breath held too long. The wounded man dragged himself across the dirt, leaving a dark stain in his wake before crawling onto his horse and following the others at a lurching pace. Elena collapsed against the porch rail, her body shaking as though the very marrow in her bones rattled with fear. Thomas turned, stepped back onto the porch and crouched before her. His hands were steady as he reached for hers, though her fingers trembled violently. "Easy now," he murmured. "It's done." But she could not stop shaking. He guided her inside, settling her near the fire's warmth. The flames leapt higher as he fed them, the glow painting the cabin walls in restless gold. He knelt beside her, pulling her hands into his, binding them gently with cloth where splinters had torn her skin. Her sleeve slipped back as he worked, and in the firelight her scar caught the glow. Not just a wound now, but something brighter, harsher, fiercer. A mark that said she had survived. Her eyes lifted to his, wide, raw, unguarded. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk your life for me?" Thomas's jaw worked as though words cost him dearly. "Because I know what it is to be left alone, to be thrown aside. No one deserves that." Tears welled hot in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks unchecked. She did not turn away this time. She let him see the depth of her hurt, just as he let her see his, the grief that had never left him, the empty chair, the unfinished rocking chair by the wall. For the first time, neither hid behind silence. The fire roared bright and unrelenting, filling the small cabin with its heat. Between them, something unspoken shifted. Not love yet, not peace, but the fragile ground where both might one day take root. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and uncertain, shadows long across the dying light. But inside, amid the fire's glow, two broken souls sat together, their pain no longer carried alone. Morning came soft as a whispered prayer. Snow fell in slow drifts, cloaking the prairie in white, turning the broken tracks of hooves and blood into pale shadows that would soon vanish. The cabin roof groaned beneath the weight, the world muffled, in stillness after the night of fire and fury. Thomas rose early, the ache of sleepless hours buried deep in his bones. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the cold. The barn loomed in the half-light, its door shut tight. Inside, bound hand and foot, the surviving rider lay on the straw, his breath steaming against the air, his face twisted with anger and humiliation. The man spat when Thomas entered. "This ain't over, cowboy. You can't keep her. You can't keep what don't belong to you." Thomas said nothing. He simply checked the ropes, pulling them tighter. The man cursed again, but Thomas didn't rise to it. There was no point. Men like him lived off fear, and Thomas would not feed him. Behind him came a sound and soft footsteps crunching on snow. He turned, surprised to see Elena at the door. Her shawl was pulled close, her braid heavy against her shoulder, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She did not falter at the sight of the man who had hunted her. For the first time, she stepped forward on her own. The rider sneered. "There she is, the runaway, the thief. Thought you could crawl into some stranger's bed and hide?" But Elena's voice cut sharp through the chill. "No more." The man blinked at her tone. Her eyes did not waver. "You will not own me. Not my name, not my life, not my future. Whatever you think you are, whatever you believe you're owed, it dies here." Her voice did not shake. Not once. Thomas, standing to one side, felt something rise in his chest. Not just pride, but something humbler, deeper. He had stood before bullets for her, but this moment, This courage was hers alone. She was no longer a shadow cowering at the edge of firelight. She was a woman reclaiming herself. The rider tried to spit another curse, but it came out weak, hollow. He looked away, as though her defiance had robbed him of his last weapon. Elena turned, her shawl brushing against the straw, and walked out into the snow without waiting for Thomas. He followed, silent, the frost crunching beneath his boots. By mid-morning, the wagon was hitched. The prisoner, bound and bitter, was thrown onto its bed. Elena climbed onto the seat beside Thomas, her shoulders squared. She did not ask to stay behind. She did not flinch when the wheels creaked forward. For the first time in months, perhaps in years, she rode upright, her spine straight against the cold. The road into town cut through wide fields of white, the world around them stark and clean. Their breath rose in steady clouds, mingling in the air between them. Neither spoke much, but they did not need to. There was something in the silence, not heavy, not fearful, but steady. When they reached the outskirts, faces turned. Townsfolk paused in their errands, their eyes narrowing as they saw the wagon, the bound man, and the woman seated beside the rancher. Whispers rippled through the streets like wind through tall grass. Some looked with pity, some with judgment, but none dared speak when they saw Thomas riding beside her, jaw set, rifle across his lap. His presence, his quiet defiance, carried weight. At the marshal's office, the door swung open and the lawman stepped out, a grizzled figure with tired eyes. "Heard trouble rode your way," he said. "Trouble rode and trouble fell," Thomas replied. He motioned to the prisoner. "This one's yours now." The marshal's men hauled the rider down, ignoring his protests, his curses, his promises of vengeance. The cell door clanged shut, and the echoes seemed to strip him of power. There would be justice now. Not spectacle, not mob, but justice. Elena stood nearby, her shawl drawn close against the wind. The cold reddened her cheeks, but she did not shiver. She held her chin high, braid neat against her back, her gaze fixed not on the prisoner but on the horizon. When it was done, she stepped outside, snow swirling around her boots. She stood straighter than she had the day before, straighter than, perhaps, she ever had. For the first time, the town did not see a fugitive, a victim, or a shadow of scandal. They saw a woman standing. The ride home was quiet. The prisoner's absence left the wagon lighter, and the road seemed less burdened than before. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, catching in Thomas's hair, gathering on the shoulders of his old coat. Beside him, Elena's hands rested. In her lap, her scar hidden beneath wool and cloth, but he knew it was there, healed though not forgotten. Neither spoke, but in the silence there was peace. Not finality, not certainty of the future, but something solid. A beginning. When the ranch came into view, smoke curling from its chimney, Elena's breath caught softly. The cabin did not look haunted anymore. Not like the place she had first stumbled into, broken and hunted. Now it looked alive. A place that had endured fire, storm, and blood, and still stood. Thomas glanced at her, catching the faint light in her eyes as she watched the roofline, the corral, the pasture blanketed in snow. He said nothing. He didn't need to. They rode the last stretch together, snowflakes melting against their coats, the cold nipping at their skin, the silence between them no longer heavy but whole, and for the first time the prairie did not seem endless or lonely. It seemed vast and waiting.